Hello and a warm welcome to the CNBC Africa Special. I'm Gugulethu Mfuphi. And today we're coming to you from Nairobi in Kenya, where we take a look at the dynamics in unpacking the various layers of a critical conversation. How to ensure that electrification can be a solution to solving the challenges that we see from a socio-economic perspective. But as we paint the landscape, we certainly know that at least 600 million Africans continue to live in darkness. So the African continent is certainly one that needs to continue to see innovative solutions brought to enable it to come to the light. However, challenges do remain despite the solutions regarding renewable energy, solar home power solutions. But how do we capitalize on digitalization and autonomous systems to really ensure that both industries, households, and economies can thrive? Well, join us, ladies and gentlemen, as we participate in this critical conversation over the next hour with my panelists who join us here today at our venue for this conversation. I'd like to warmly welcome on stage leaders, innovators, and entrepreneurs who are critical participants within this conversation. To my right-hand side, Johan Albert, Country Manager for Kenya at Siemens, followed by Pauline Githugu, External Affairs Director at M-Kopa Solar, and John Kidenda, Director for Software Platforms at PowerGen Renewable Energy. Without further ado, I'd like us to start off with our conversation and really get an understanding of the landscape. What are we dealing with from an operational point of view? And most importantly, where do we see critical opportunities arising from? Johan, I'd like to start off with you by getting some perspective on the reality of the landscape. And I think it's quite critical for us to really ensure that we highlight Siemens and the commitment that this global entity has made to the continent, being around for just shy of 2 centuries. But digital as well as analog and an autonomous organization is essentially what you're trying to implement within the electrification space. Talk to us about these opportunities, but also understanding the realities of the current situation we face.
Thank you, Gugu, and yeah, good morning to our good audience and to everybody listening. This is quite a vast and a large question to address, and I'm going to try and keep it relevant to the context of today. Siemens, a company that's been around for more than 170 years, has reinvented itself to be relevant in its context, wherever they find themselves in the world. If we look at Africa, specifically East Africa, narrowing it down to today's event here in Kenya, there are a vast number of challenges. One, the traditional way of rolling out electricity, as we've seen it in the Americas, to Europe's Southern Africa, is not living up to the expectations and in the way that Eastern Africa and Kenya is developing. If we look at some of the past technologies like mobile, like banking, it's taken leapfrogs. Where the rest of the world is catching up. And these leapfrogs are creating demands. So the traditional way of rolling out large-scale transmission solutions down to distribution solutions into the households, getting households to participate, to fund these, unfortunately is not working in the same way as the rest of the world. So this is one of the challenges. The other challenge that we're facing is around the regulation side. The current regulation doesn't completely incorporate these requirements, these fast-moving, outpacing requirements that we see. The technologies are there, the will is there, and then the speed has just overtaken us. The other factor that we're also facing that we as Siemens believe needs to be addressed is access to funding. Large-scale rollouts require a huge amount of funding. And funds are not that readily available at this stage. If we look at FDI projects, if we look at donor funding, we look at the different European efforts towards electrifying and bringing electrification, not just electrifying Kenya, it's just not enough. And we need to look at alternatives like microgrids, like nanogrids, like solar solutions that we're going to look at. So these are some of the topics we believe that needs to be addressed. We as Siemens believe we positioned through the whole value chain correctly to be able to assist, but we're going to need to collaborate. And this is one of the points. The traditional way of approaching the market in silos or with Chinese walls, so to speak, those days are gone. The speed requires that we take hands and we find better ways and more relevant ways for Africa to position itself so that we can bring electricity to each and every household out there in the quickest possible way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Critical elements that you've certainly highlighted on, and I'd like us to build up on some of these themes. However, Pauline, I'd like to come to you just to get your understanding of the current landscape. Given the organization that you represent, it certainly needs no introduction within this audience and even from a global stage, as M-Kopa is often referenced as a solid example and leader, game changer when it comes to solar home solutions, servicing well over, 500,000 homes across the East African region?
Now 600,000.
Bumped up by 100,000.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for us, coming as M-Kopa there and seeing the massive challenge that there is in East Africa, in Kenya, and around Africa, the key thing that we looked at was affordability. So we all have these aspirations that we all need to have electricity in our homes, but then there's a lot of people who we aspire to have electricity, or who aspire to have electricity but really cannot afford it. And that's where M-Kopa came in with the innovation of pay-as-you-go. So it allows a user to actually purchase a solar home system that will come with the lights and basic communication equipment, like a radio and a torch and phone charging, which is very critical for them to make the payments by keeping their phones working. And all that comes in a package, and people can access that at a very minimal deposit and pay for the balance of a period of time, mostly a year, and many of them go beyond a year. So we came looking and targeting the bottom of the pyramid, because there's a lot of people in that segment who are already disadvantaged by not having electricity because it has not reached them, or are disadvantaged by not having electricity, even if it's running overhead over them, sure, what we call under the grid, but it's running over them because they cannot access it, they cannot afford it, and that's where M-Kopa comes in. And so the challenge continues. There's a lot of people, not just in East Africa, but across Africa and even in other continents, and I think Africa can be an example to others and how to find solutions that work for us and work for the many, and then roll it out to other parts of the world. And that's where companies like M-Kopa and others are leading the way in showing the example that we have homegrown solutions for African, call them African problems, but we have solutions that actually can make a difference.
Exactly. Yeah. Impacting the lives of individuals within the household, and of course looking to develop that even further. John, I'd like to come to you, of course representing innovative solutions, especially from a microgrid perspective. Give us your understanding and current view on the lay of the land.
Okay, so we're a Kenyan company, have been in operation for about 7 years now. We build mini-grids. We've built on an EPC type framework where we've built over 50 mini-grids around the East African region. We also own and manage our own grids. We have about 7,000 customers, households that we provide electricity to across Kenya and Tanzania on a prepaid basis using mobile money, as was mentioned previously. And we have a dual mission at PowerGen. We want to electrify the 600 million people who do not have electricity currently, and we want to build the energy system of the future for the African continent. And for that, for us, that means two things. The mini-grids that we build are grid interconnection ready. So when the grid arrives, there is no additional reticulation that is necessary. You plug into our power box, and basically you just change the source of energy. In the period between when the grid arrives and when we install our power box, we power our systems with solar power, with diesel backup, and provide upwards of 95% power uptime for our customers. And I would agree with both my fellow panelists on what is important in order to scale up electrification across all the sectors that we play in, whether that's solar home systems, mini-grids like we build, or large grid infrastructure. That's sorting out the financing and sorting out the policy environment. For financing, we need financing to cover the CapEx costs, financing to cover distribution costs, and we need smart, fast, and efficient financing. the mini-grid community in the East African region has come together to form an organization called the African Mini-Grid Developers Association, where we're advocating specifically for what we call a smart RBF as a targeted, clear recommendation on how financing can be solved. And we can speak about that later. And on the policy side of things, what we need is clarity. We need to know what the rules are and how they apply to all the sectors that we play in. A lot of people often think that when we push for policy, we're saying we want you to design policy that is exclusively favorable to us so that we can grow. We might want that, but that's not usually what we're talking about. What we want to do is to know the rules so that we can plan effectively. Because for mini-grids specifically, we're building infrastructure. We're building plants that we want to be in the ground serving the community for 20 to 25 years. We need to plan on a 20 to 25-year horizon. And for that, we need certainty around the policy environment. And so certainty around policy and smart financing are the two things that are.
Indeed. Well, some critical elements that each of you have highlighted as panelists, and of course these are some of the themes that we'll be engaging in. Certainly capital top of mind, policy to provide certainty, and of course ensuring that there is a collaborative effort between all the major stakeholders, not only here in the room, but in the market overall. I'd like to stick with you, John, and actually build up on some of the themes that you alluded to, and policy is one of those that you built up on. Let's start there. Are we actually working towards a common vision? Electrification is something which is so critical and we're all addressing it in different ways, but do we have a common purpose, common vision in actually understanding the role that the various stakeholders can play in actively participating together to achieve electrification?
I would say the short answer is no. And I say that because we consider ourselves a Kenyan company that's serving the African continent. And what I'm seeing on the African continent in terms of policy landscape is a lot of really interesting experimentation, which is good. But there isn't enough conversation happening across these national jurisdictions to harmonize policy across the continent. Because if we want companies that are going to be able to scale in this sector, we're going to need companies that are not designed to just function within one very esoteric policy environment that's designed for Kenya. We need collaboration, we need sharing of ideas, and then the spreading of good ideas across the continent. Yeah. We're getting a lot of support from entities such as the Africa Development Bank, for instance, that's trying to design an Africa-wide RBF. That's very difficult when you have divergent policy environments. So I would say coming together towards a centralized vision may be happening at the national level, but I don't see it happening at the continent.
Pauline, I'd like to come to you to get your thoughts as to what particular elements of policy actually need to be changed in order to empower the different collaborative efforts from each of your stakeholders.
Yeah, so I'll take a step back from what John was just saying and just say that as far as policies are concerned, I think in Africa we don't have a shortage of policies. They're beautifully crafted policies, probably gathering dust in different parts of government offices. That is a fact, I think, which sadly is what it is. But two things I see. One is that whereas there was a good thought towards some of the initiatives that are currently happening, and the reason why we see them happening is because it provided an enabling environment for some of these things to begin to come up off the ground. It's, there was a thought around that. But the thing that now is happening is that as they gather dust in the shelves, innovation is going faster and faster than the policies can keep up. Yeah. So policymakers are playing catch up, and to his point, talking about how you find there's excitement in one country and then there's excitement in another. It's really around the implementation of those policies. So where a country wakes up and begins to implement what they've already beautifully crafted, then there's some excitement towards there. Depending on the speed of their implementation, if they're not moving fast enough, as I've said, with innovation moving faster than they, then they'll be, attracted to a different market that is moving fast or faster.
Sure.
So it's in my view, it's not that we don't have the policies, they're there. It's the implementation that is slow, and as it slows down, innovation moves much faster than it can catch up.
I'd like us then to move on to capital, because we've both all certainly mentioned that capital is of the essence. Once we have the certainty of the policy, that's when we can ensure that the money is able to be rolled out. But just exactly looking at the figures, I understand that there's about a shortage of $93 billion that needs to be rolled out annually just to address the energy and infrastructure needs required across East Africa. Where is the money? Is the money available? And why are we not accessing it? Johan, should we start with you?
Why not?
Give us your view.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And in different forums in Kenya, we've been debating how to better access, because the finance is available.
Sure.
If it might be in donor or financing or hybrid solutions. And I'll talk a little bit about the more modern solutions and how we can address this. The financing is available. The access to the financing, the application of the financing, directing it to the problem or the need is where the critical elements are missing. And this is where, if we come back, I don't want to revert back to the policy, but if we have standards, proper policies to underscore and guide beyond 1 or 2 election periods, so to speak, then these finances will be applied correctly. Mm-hmm. So it is available, and then if you look at Kenya moving its status from a donor country upwards, there's a lot of other alternatives. But that brings new challenges, because the local banking sector or financing sector, might it be private or government,
sure,
is not geared up for the volumes that you spoke about. And those volumes is to get out of the starting blocks. To address the basic needs. It's not to address the future. So there's still a big dilemma. We're trying to address how to get out of the starting block, where our discussion and our thinking is what shall tomorrow and the day after looks like. So we need more than the traditional finance as well. And that's a critical component. And one of the elements that we at Siemens are looking at, and we've got a couple of test cases, is how to use blockchain. Now, if we talk blockchain, people think cryptocurrencies, and this is not what we're talking about.
It's the system behind it, right?
It's the system behind it that gives you governance, that reduces administration, that brings confidence to investors. Because at the end of the day, it's about the bottom line, and people want surety when they give $1 or $1 million, that the investment is to the right direction. So technology like blockchain and its initial phases will support all those sort of needs.
Sure.
And it will allow multiple participation of finance. And this will help us to get some of these projects going faster. If we rely on, and not to hit on a sector, but the banking sector, a typical turnaround on a large finance can be anything from 12 to 18 months. That doesn't address our needs of today.
Sure. John, I'd like you to come in here. I understand you've previously referenced concessional funding as a potential solution here. Are we tapping into that opportunity appropriately? And how do we drive it and expedite that process?
Once again, no. I think concessional financing is and will continue to be important for the sector. There's no place in the world.
And is it the right example, exactly, given the global reference that we often allude to?
There's no place in the world that has ever achieved universal electrification without significant concessional financing for their rural electrification needs. So unless we're going to say that, okay, for the first time in the history of the world, we're going to make the poor rural resident in Africa pay for the full cost of their own electrification and completely divert from how we've done it in the rest of the world, concessional financing is going to be a key part of the solution. I want to make a distinction between financing announced and financing deployed. We need more financing. We're always going to say, by the way, in case you don't know, we're always going to say we need more money. That is a fact. But I want to step away from that conversation first. There is a distinction, and a surprisingly large distinction, between financing announced and financing deployed. If all the financing that had been announced for the sectors that we work in had actually gone through and been deployed to entities, whether it was public or private entities that are then going to execute on these projects, we would be having a very different conversation. But there is a breakdown between the very good, well-intentioned efforts to organize financing around these sectors.
So what goes wrong?
Yes, and what happens at the end of the term of whatever that financing instrument is. What goes wrong is that, in our opinion, we generate a level of complexity around ensuring that the financing is effectively used that effectively renders it useless. So you get a situation where the financing partner rightly is concerned in ensuring that if they give the money, the electricity is going to arrive. And therefore, they want to have a 3-year due diligence period on the company that's going to deploy this thing. Yet, the financing instrument has a life of 4 years. Yeah. And so you end up at year 3, everybody is panicking, trying to get that money out of the door. And at year 4, you have 0 or very few projects actually built. And this is one of the reasons why one of the main things that us as AMDA are pushing and that PowerGen is really keen on is providing solutions for this bottleneck. And our suggestion is that you simplify the due diligence process and move to a results-based financing model that reduces risks for everyone and also aligns incentives for the developer, because if he doesn't develop, he doesn't get paid, and the financier, because he only pays, or she only pays when the project is developed.
Indeed. I want us to start with our closing comments, and most importantly, to have tangible solutions that we can implement within making sure that electrification does help address the socio-economic needs here in Kenya and, of course, the East African environment. Bearing in mind that creating jobs, creating industries, and, of course, opportunities for employment is quite critical, but also unlocking additional economic opportunities through digitalization, through autonomy, and, of course, the cultivation of new innovative solutions to help us literally empower, pun intended, the electrification of these critical economies. John, I'd like to start with you as we make our way down the panelists to talk about tangible solutions that we can implement, either as a collaborative effort as various stakeholders, or perhaps from the microgrid representatives as to what it is that you're committed to do to actually see that we shift the landscape and the needle when we have this conversation next year this time again.
Okay. 2 things for me. 1, let us support and continue to put pressure on our great policy support consultants, people like GIZ who are structuring the frameworks that we need in order to effectively have clarity on what we're investing in and what the returns will be. I applaud GIZ and your help in bringing this together. We need to keep the pressure on and ensure that framework is out as soon as possible so that we can move. 2, smart RBF. Let us push on financing, specifically results-based financing that aligns the interests of the financiers to reduce their risk of project development, sure, and our interest in getting quick payouts when we deliver results.
Pauline, your closing remarks. You've clearly managed to change lives and, of course, empower individuals, not only through their households, but, of course, socio-economic participation through knowledge sharing, given the recent elections that took place in Kenya. Yeah. What commitment are you going to stand by that can be a tangible solution?
Okay, for us, our commitment is one, having seen the great strides that solar has made, is to just continue with that conversation that really solar is not a second-rate solution for while you wait for the grid. It's actually a viable solution that provides electrification, and that is the means within which a lot of Africans will actually find power in their homes that is good, clean energy. And that is what is going to replace the use of kerosene across the continent. And so for me, my remarks would be that I think it's time for us as Africa to take a step back and really ask ourselves critical questions like, what do we have in our hands? And we have this sunshine that we have in our hands all day, 12 hours every single day. We don't have short days, we don't have long days. We basically have, you know, the same amount of daytime hours, and we need to harness that to provide solutions for us. Sure. So let's not wait for another, you know, big solution that's going to come from somewhere, but let's use what we have in our hands already.
Sure. Yeah. Johan, your closing comments?
There's so much opportunity, and Africa, East Africa, Kenya, provides so much, but how to harness. We've got various organizations in the room. We've got the German Chamber as an example supporting us here today. We've talked about the GIZ, there are other chambers. How do we collaborate between the private, the public, and government sectors to bring it to bear? That's the one question. I think there's good momentum in that, and we need to build on that. But what's important, and I want to go more to a technology perspective, a more Siemens perspective, de-risking of projects through platforms that we as Siemens provide, IoT, open platforms in the cloud, products like MindSphere as an example, where if we take your example of the geothermal wells, where you can create a digital twin and you can qualify your project, that will help you to de-risk. So this is very important, just to use an example in all the aspects. How do we de-risk? How do we shorten delivery times? How do we shorten decision-making times and shorten financing times? That's going to require partnering with the right companies like a Siemens to support you in this quest. And the benefit will translate right down onto the ground.
Indeed. Well, some critical points that have certainly been highlighted, but it all goes back to a collaborative efforts, receiving certainty from the policies that are implemented, and of course, understanding that through remaining agile and adaptable in this ever-fluid market, that we can be able to work together to address the electrification concerns and needs across sub-Saharan Africa. With that said, it does draw our conversation for today to a close. A big thank you once more to my panelists, Johan Halberg, Country Manager for Kenya at Siemens, Pauline Githugu, External Affairs Director at M-Kopa Solar, and John Kidenda, Director for Software Platforms at PowerGen Renewable Energy. One thing is certain, that the conversations will certainly continue, and of course, solutions need to be sourced and most importantly, implemented to address the electrification concerns we have. Thank you so much for joining us and being part of the Siemens Dialogue. Until next time, take care.
Thank you.